How about it for the professor when it comes to Middle East history, when it comes to government, politics? He's such a deep, deep reservoir of great information. John Rothmann, everybody. I should also mention he hosts a daily podcast called Around the Political World with John Rothmann. And I've subscribed, and I recommend that you do also. John, I want to put the Middle East thing aside for a moment.
Right.
And I want to talk about what happened with the former President Donald Trump's former chief of staff in the White House, Mark Meadows, apparently making a deal, getting immunity. This is a report from ABC News. And I wonder if you could speak to how that affects the Trump world of litigation, of court cases, and of re-election.
It affects it profoundly, Mark. The shift by Mark Thompson to this particular subject from everything else shows his astute ability to judge a situation. Mark Meadows is the man who was with Donald Trump constantly in the White House. He probably knows more about the functioning in those weeks than anybody else. And his flipping, which is evidently what he is doing, is a tremendous blow to Donald Trump. It will have ramifications down the road. And the most interesting thing for me will be what the response will be of the Trump people. You alluded to the fact that Mark Meadows wrote a book, which I read. I actually tried to get him on my program at KGO when the book first came out, and he wouldn't do it, despite connections which I've had over the years with a variety of people who know him. Clearly, the book was a myth. And so it will enter into the annals of memoirs as just that, a myth. But for Donald Trump, this is a terrifying time. Not only does he have Mark Meadows, but he has the legal team, which he used, 3 critical attorneys who have now flipped on him, talking about the Georgia case. And he has his former fixer, the man who was his right hand, Michael Cohen, before he was president, now testifying against him in New York. So the walls are closing in. Now, here's the question. The newly elected Speaker of the House of Representatives is a man who defended Donald Trump. He also, which I want to make clear, wrote an amicus brief. Now, remember, he's from Louisiana, but he wrote an amicus brief for those states challenging the election results. It's all nonsense. It's all proven to be fraudulent. And yet today, the Republican Party elected as Speaker of the House of Representatives, an election denier, with, I hasten to point out, the endorsement of Donald Trump. So we have to hope the House functions, and we have to hope that everything goes smoothly. But Mark Meadows, Jenna Ellis, the combination of all of these flips, let me tell you something. This is something, the next person I'm looking at is Rudy Giuliani. Because Giuliani, everything points to Rudy Giuliani as part of this conspiracy. Jenna Ellis spoke of his senior as a senior lawyer who she trusted. How will the Republican Party react to this? And what does it mean, Mark, when the Republican Party, as it did today, elects a Speaker of the House of Representatives who is an election denier, staunchly in the pocket of Donald Trump, and who Donald Trump endorsed? This is a fascinating moment in American politics.
I'd also suggest that his politics beyond the election denying and this ridiculousness, and as you say, he'll now lead that parade in many ways. His politics on gay rights, on any number of things associated with what you might consider a wedge issue, they're stereotypically hard right, deep South. I mean, again, in the stereotypical sense of that. He just in terms of legislation that he backs, and it's the same-sex marriage, for example. He's against that. He's against. I mean, he represents that extreme wing of the right.
I regret to say it's not an extreme wing in the Republican Party. What was extreme from our perspective has now become mainstream. And the speech that needed to be listened to today was Elise Stefanik nominating him, the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives, nominating him for the speakership. It was appalling. And but by the way, Elise Stefanik once was viewed as a moderate Republican and no longer can be classified that way. For the Republican Party, this is a departure from traditional Republican values. And all I can tell you is it's to me deeply distressing. By the way, I listened only to a bit because I have to listen to you in order to prepare for this program. But I listened briefly to the new speaker's presentation about Hakeem Jeffries, and he did note that although they disagree on many, many issues, he is prepared to work with the Democratic leader. And that to me was very encouraging. But you are precisely correct in pointing out that the new speaker is to the right of the right in the Republican Party.
So, however they put this coalition together, they put it together. I mean, I always often feel, and this is particularly borne out when you look at what they vote, how they vote behind closed doors. I always feel like the public face of the GOP is different than the private face of the GOP. That, you know, they rep this Trump thing when privately they're not as on board with Trump. It's the same thing we found out about all these Fox News Channel people. But nonetheless, when the vote comes,
matter.
Exactly, when the rubber meets the road, they're there.
It is exactly their public face. It is exactly what the new speaker represents. It is exactly the kind of extreme positions within the Republican Party. And to be honest with you, it's a sad day for the Republican Party, but the Democrats should be very happy because it means that they will have an easier case to make. One other quick point. I know you want to go to the Middle East, and so do I, but I want to point out for Donald Trump, it is very possible that what is happening now will ultimately deny him the Republican nomination. If it doesn't, if his present popularity is sustained and he is the nominee of the Republican Party, the Democrats are going to have a field day with this guy. And the country's divisions will be highlighted. But I can tell you for the Democrats, they believe they are on the winning team at this point because there is no doubt that what Donald Trump is promulgating and what the new speaker promulgated is antithetical to everything we believe in the United States.
Well, it's certainly, inconsistent, true with polling. I mean, I think stuff happens, and you could see if a war breaks out in the Middle East that draws in America, and we'll get to the Middle East now. If existing Ukraine situation, you've got price of gas going on. There are certain things that could come together. A constellation of variables might make it possible. It will be a burden, perhaps, on the incumbent, Joe Biden. But as you've suggested, Trump's got his own baggage. So, more on that next time. I want to ask you about what's happening in the Middle East. And one of the disturbing things I'll share first is and this has become a real sticking point, is the way that those who are advocates for Palestinians and for Palestinian rights and for what's happened in Gaza and reflecting what's happened historically in Gaza don't really respond to the question, what do you think of the Hamas attack that initiated this entire narrative most recently, in any kind of way that suggests that there are real sympathies there? I think that's hurt that cause. Apart from that, I think there are decent points being made to represent the situation and circumstance that the Gazans find themselves in. Speak to some of that in your assessment of what's going on.
First of all, I always listen to the Mark Thompson program. I want people to know that and do subscribe. But at the same time, I have to listen to what's going on in the news. And this morning, the President of the United States at the White House, greeting the Prime Minister of Australia, reaffirmed America's commitment to Israel, but at the same time said Hamas did not represent and does not represent most of the Palestinian people. With all due respect, I differ. If popular elections were held in the West Bank, there is no doubt that Hamas would win. There is no doubt that in Gaza, Hamas would win as well. Unfortunately, the Hamas covenant, which stresses the idea that Israel should not exist, is the popular image. And one of the most disturbing things that happened today is that President Erdogan of Turkey, who was planning a visit to Israel, not only canceled the trip to Israel, but denied the fact that Hamas were terrorists. And one other quick point, so I get all of this in. There was a meeting yesterday in Lebanon of the three most extreme radical forces: Nasrallah of Lebanon, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. Why are they meeting together? Well, they clearly are doing it with the imprimatur of Iran. And there is a real danger of the widening of this war. I also want to point out to you that the president today, our president, appealed for peace on the West Bank. Let me assure you that is the furthest thing from what is in the mind of the Palestinians on the West Bank. And the Israelis feel threatened. This morning, Prime Minister Netanyahu said, and I believe him to be correct, that this threat to Israel is a threat to the very existence of the Jewish state. And we have to understand, whatever side you're on, nobody wants innocent people to die. But the Israelis made another observation that intrigued me. What happened in Gaza, the atrocity that came from Gaza to hit Israel itself, has receded in the public mind, which is not a surprise. We are headline-oriented. And so the horrific events inflicted by Hamas on Israelis, the murder of Jews. And did you hear, Mark, yesterday, the recording played at the United Nations by the Israeli ambassador of a Hamas terrorist who had just participated in the attack, who called his parents, his mother and father, to tell them he was proud to tell them he had killed a Jew and had Jewish blood on his hands, and his parents blessed him for it. When Israelis hear that, let me assure you, it sends a shiver up and down the spine of every Israeli, and I would suggest to you every Jew as well. This is a moment when there is deep concern. All right, I hope I answered the question.
No, and you answered it, and I think you put a face on it a bit. As I've heard, and we're going to in the next half hour after you talk further about this with someone who's been a high-profile person talking about the heartbreak associated with the Hamas attack, but the heartbreak associated with the anticipated military response and the collective punishment of Gazans as a result of a desire to root out Hamas. Can you speak to that, please?
Yes. Yeah. Netanyahu announced that that the Israelis are going to go ahead with a ground action in Gaza. I do not believe that your term is correct. It is not a collective punishment. It is a collective response. No nation can allow terrorists to come from the border and kill innocent civilians. Now, for those who say, well, this is a terrible action by Israel, my question is, what's the alternative? If the Israelis had come to the United Nations, and we'll say a word about the Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, in a moment, but if they'd come to the United Nations and said, we're not going in, it's up to you guys go in, what do you think the United Nations would have done? And I'll tell you, not a thing. And the statement by the Secretary General of the United Nations, who has, well, it was unbelievable. He called for a ceasefire. He did not condemn Hamas until the Israelis said, you ought to resign. And then he said, oh, but I include my condemnation of what Hamas did. The Israelis will not accept this notion. And the United Nations, which has never been particularly friendly to Israel, at least in recent years, needs to shape up. And I understand the pressures the Secretary General is under, but this is absolutely inexcusable. I am still waiting for the United Nations to condemn what Hamas did. They're quick to condemn Israel. But where is the condemnation? Where is the outrage? Where is the fury? And that, Mark, is what is driving many Jews in this country to ask a simple question. Where is the world?
The history of Israel is one that's been marked by being ignored by the UN and being the UN vote essentially has pretty much gone against Israel for many, many years. The UN, when it comes to votes and it comes to the politics of the UN, you know this, John, it lines up along various alliances that all stack against the Jewish state of Israel, I believe.
All you have to do, Mark, is remember when the United Nations, on November the 10th, 1975, equated Zionism with racism. And I will always remember the eloquent words of Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was then our ambassador to the United Nations, and the eloquent words of Chaim Herzog, who was then the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations. And I also recall that when the Soviet Union collapsed, and after the peace agreement between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, the United Nations took an unprecedented action, and it rescinded the resolution equating Zionism with racism. The UN has never rescinded a resolution until that moment. And one can only hope that the forces driving the United Nations now will come to their senses. Russia and China, both members of the Security Council, are lining up with Hamas. It's astounding to me.
The irony of this, and you can help me with the history, but didn't Israel get formed by the UN? I mean, it was a British, I understand the British controlled the territory, but I thought the UN set them up.
On November 29th, 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into two states. Remember, they had partitioned India as well, which is what resulted in the creation of Pakistan. So they created the opportunity for a free, independent Jewish state, which is precisely what they talked about, and a free, independent Palestinian Arab state. The Israelis accepted and embraced the resolution. The Arabs rejected it. And you're reading my book, Icon of Evil, Hitler's Mufti and the Rise of Radical Islam. I describe that vividly in that book. Every time there has been an attempt by Israel to reach out, it has been rebuffed. And to the credit of Egypt and Jordan, and yes, to the Abraham Accords, and now the outreach to Saudi Arabia, which probably won't go anywhere now, the simple truth is that the United Nations has to catch up with the rest of the world. Israel is a fact. It's not going away. And just remember, so everybody understands this, the point of Hamas and what it's doing and its acceptance by most of the Palestinians, and I underline that, most of the Palestinians do accept Hamas. The intention is not only the destruction of Israel, which they state clearly in their covenant, but also the destruction of Jews. Remember Article 7 of the Hamas covenant. You can all Google it and read it. It comes from the Haditha. If a Jew should hide behind a rock or a tree, let the rock or the tree cry out, "There is a Jew behind me. Come and kill him." Not an Israeli, a Jew. And I say this out of deep frustration. The Palestinians have rights, and everybody has to understand that. And what's happening in Gaza now is terrible. But let me point out, Palestinians have rights, but not at the expense of Israel's right to exist. And what is happening now is not created by Israel, rather created by Hamas and the dastardly, horrific deed that they conducted on October 7th.
Won't Israel, John, need to negotiate with Hamas, even though it is essentially what you suggested, a terrorist organization bent on killing the last Jew on earth, or whatever they say in there, whatever. I mean, I get it. I mean, you've made the point, and you made it well. But you need to negotiate with this group that controls the Palestinian cause, right?
You said something that intrigued me, that Israel should negotiate with Hamas. First of all, Hamas will never negotiate with Israel. Absolutely not, because they don't believe that Israel has a right to exist. But do you negotiate with pure evil? Do you remember when this great country formed an alliance to defeat Nazi Germany? And there were some who suggested, oh, how about a negotiated peace? And what was the response of the United States and the free world? You cannot live in a world with people who hate. Now, I am willing to compromise. And let me point out to you, Israel was willing to compromise. Remember when the Palestine Liberation Organization declared its intention to destroy Israel? And if you remember, thanks to the Oslo Accords, the Palestine Liberation Organization ultimately recognized Israel's right to exist. And do you remember the famous handshake on the White House lawn between Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat? The tragedy here is that the Palestinian Authority has failed. Mahmoud Abbas has 86 years old, no power, hasn't faced an election because he's afraid to hold an election. And you and I know why, because Hamas would win. This tragic cycle leads Israel to believe, and I believe there is unanimity in Israel, left and right, people who oppose Netanyahu and support Netanyahu. There is a unanimity. You cannot make a deal with people who are determined to destroy you in your state, in your faith, in who you are. What a tragic commentary. And if I may go back to the United Nations for a moment, how is it possible that the United Nations, which passes resolutions on a whole host of topics, could not have condemned what happened on October 7th?
I mean,
That's
the pain of October 7th is a legitimate one. I mean, a super legitimate one. So I guess I come back to, what do you do, John? Now, this idea, and the reason I used collective punishment before, is when you say, I'm cutting off water, I'm cutting off food, that does grab, you talk about the news cycle, that is now part of the slow death, if you will, of so many within Gaza. How does that help the Israeli cause? However you...
It doesn't.
Yeah,
and it's
okay.
not Israel's burden, it's Hamas's burden.
But
Hamas needs
that's
to
a tough
stand up.
sell right now in Gaza, you would agree.
No, it shouldn't be. Oh, if it is a tough sell, it's because Hamas has the support of the people of Gaza.
Sure.
Which tells you why the Israelis are taking the action they're taking. Let me tell you bluntly, you want some sort of discussion? Let Hamas release all the hostages now. Let Hamas formally apologize for what happened on the 7th. And I will tell you that the gates of discussion would open. But what do you hear from Hamas? Hamas is meeting in Beirut yesterday. They met yesterday, as I opened with Nasrallah, Hezbollah, if you will, with Islamic Jihad. These are supported by Iran, and they make no distinction. They want what they call the Zionist entity destroyed. Now, how do you negotiate with someone who wants to destroy you? I have full sympathy for the Palestinian people. But you and I understand, Mark, that if a ceasefire were to be declared, the result would be a victory for Hamas. All they will do is rebuild. What is the reluctance to send in food and water and so forth? The answer is because Hamas seizes this, not for the people of Gaza, but for themselves. And I want to correct.
Okay, I want to get your correction, but I want to just understand, if you allow, couldn't there have been, John, a continued allowance of food and the supplies to Gaza and still pursue Israeli tactical military operations? Yeah.
Absolutely. But
it feels like that might be the answer.
Do you know why those tunnels were constructed, Mark? Does anybody discuss that? Concrete was sent in to Gaza years ago to try to rebuild Gaza.
Yeah, it was supposed to be a public works project, kind of, right?
Yes, public relief. And what did Hamas do? They seized the concrete and they used it to build their underground city, their tunnels. Where was the outcry? Where was the distress? Look, it is a shame that Hamas has inflicted on their own people, the Palestinian people, this horrific event. But to blame the victim for the outcome is just plain wrong. I am in favor and support every effort to try to provide humanitarian assistance. At the same time, let the United Nations pass a resolution condemning what happened on October the 7th. Let them pass a resolution calling for just what you and I are saying, for humanitarian aid. But remember, if you call for a ceasefire, that's exactly what Hamas wants, because that gives them the chance to do what they're doing now. Did you hear that just a few hours ago, they were firing missiles on Tel Aviv?
I mentioned that at the start of the show.
They were firing missiles on Eilat.
Yeah.
They were firing missiles on Haifa. Well, let me ask you something. When someone is firing missiles at you and calls for your destruction, what do you do? How do you respond? By the way, that is the challenge in Israel. The Israelis have restrained themselves. They have called up their reserves. They're ready to go. They're waiting. They're waiting in part because those hostages, no doubt, will die, and they need to be released. Men, women, and children. One other quick comment. Why have the 2 Israeli women who were released been so restrained in their comments? The answer is their husbands are still held by Hamas. I mean, I understand, and believe me, I haven't slept much this last few weeks, and I cry over this because it is a tragedy for the Israelis, for Jews around the world, And it is a tragedy for the Palestinian people. They need to repudiate this kind of activity once and for all. In fact, the challenge should be to Mahmoud Abbas to hold free elections on the West Bank so that the
Yeah,
Palestinian Authority can win, but they won't. You know that. Hamas will win.
Now, a final question, John, just because I'm out of time, but I really do want to address one thing that's a bit uncomfortable. And maybe you can set the record straight on this. It was my understanding that Hamas got support, certainly from the Netanyahu government, on some level, some money, some support, because the narrative goes that within the Netanyahu government, there was a sense that supporting Hamas would help weaken the Palestinian Authority. Will you speak to that Hamas is I mean, this overstates it, but this is kind of the sizzle headline. Hamas is sort of partially the creation of the Netanyahu government. I don't think that really states it accurately.
Absolutely untrue.
Yeah, but speak to the support, though. Speak to the support.
Hamas was created, as you know, in 1988. Sheikh Yassin was its creator. The Israelis, by the way, got him, clearly.
Right. But what it is now, it's suggested, is as a result of the support of Netanyahu government in part. Speak to that,
absolutely
please.
Not. And the Netanyahu government would deny that, absolutely. And I can tell you, as somebody who studies the Middle East, that's the kind of erroneous disinformation which is spread.
So Hamas didn't get money from Israel?
No, of course not.
Okay.
Well, I'll tell you what Israel did. Israel tried to live side by side with Hamas, believing, and that's what the Israelis who lived on the border believed, that if they maintained good relations, they provided all of the health care and so forth that was necessary, that maybe the attitude would soften, that maybe the people of Gaza would soften in their attitude. Who are the most shocked people in all of this, Mark? The Israelis who lived on the border, who overwhelmingly were not Netanyahu supporters, who overwhelmingly wanted some sort of peaceful solution. And what happened to them? They were slaughtered. Do you know that one of the people, as this slaughter was taking place, spoke in Arabic, spoke fluent Arabic, explained, I'm not your enemy. And you know what they did? They killed that individual.
Well, we've talked before about the fact that there were teachers in that group, and that spoke both Arabic and Hebrew, and were trying to bridge these two worlds, and we're teaching kids.
I've been part of a group called Hand in Hand, where Arab and Jewish children have gone to school together for the purpose of trying to ease tensions. When there was a program years ago called Interns for Peace, where Jews went to work in Arab areas, I was fully supportive of that. When the Wallachs created the peace camp in Washington, D.C., your home turf, I interviewed the Wallachs on KGO repeatedly and encouraged that cooperation among Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Baha'i. The whole idea was to try to find vehicles that would bridge the gap. But let me say, I know we've got to close. Let me just say to people, imagine when someone says they are coming to kill you. In Jewish tradition, we are told, if someone says they're coming to kill you, believe them. And if you wonder about Israel being haunted by the Holocaust, and there are still survivors alive, the main complaint of Israelis is the world was silent 80 years ago. Why are they silent now? And I want to suggest to people, the next few weeks are going to be absolutely compelling. And Mark, of course, I want to thank you for the opportunity to try to answer these questions. I'll come back anytime, because this issue, ladies and gentlemen, well, if in fact Hezbollah, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad get together under the auspices of Iran, which is a real possibility, and if those rockets fly, as they are now, toward Tel Aviv, but in a more intense way, Nasrallah has 150,000 rockets. You want to see terror? You want to see a horrific outcome? If they fire those rockets, Iron Dome cannot take them all down. And it will be absolutely a bloodbath. And I guarantee you one thing. In Israel, there is an expression in Hebrew, ein brera, no alternative. And I think it was summed up very well by someone who said, one of the soldiers, we have no place else to go. And so, unfortunately, this will be a tragedy. But one more thing, I know you've got to go, but Let's see what the House of Representatives does today. The first resolution to be presented, as I understand it, will be a resolution supporting Israel. It may be coupled with aid to Ukraine. There is some resistance in Republican ranks. I cannot tell you what Speaker Johnson will do on that regard, but it will be a good indicator, and it will be great fodder for those of you who tune in daily to the Mark Thompson program.
Well, these are serious times, John. I appreciate you always being available and shedding some light. You've come from a clear perspective, but you inform that perspective with a lot of great history and facts. So we appreciate you so much.
I appreciate the fact you've given me the chance. Thanks very much. See you when you want me.
All right, John Rothmann, everybody. In on Wednesdays. You got it. Mm-hmm. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.